The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 24th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme...
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Presumptive Democratic nominee Kamala Harris clarifies the choice between someone who convicted criminals and a convicted criminal. Also ahead, Ukraine's foreign minister visits China, perhaps to suggest that they could choose their friends more wisely. Uganda's elderly president attempts to stop anti-corruption protests from spreading. Later in the show, we'll wrap up the latest business news and we'll preview Monocle Radio's imminent fortnight of programming from Paris. All that coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. US Vice President Kamala Harris began her campaign for the US presidency in earnest last night in Milwaukee, site of last week's Republican National Convention and, not coincidentally, biggest city in the key swing state of Wisconsin, which was won by President Joe Biden in 2020 by just 20,000 votes. Harris sought to frame the contest between her and Republican nominee Donald Trump as one between a former prosecutor and a convicted criminal, which is indeed one indisputably accurate way of looking at it. Well, I'm joined with more by Scott Lucas, adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Scott, ever since she ran for president herself in 2020, there have been doubts about her ability as a campaigner, and of course she was then somewhat cloistered for 4 years, as vice presidents always are. What did you make of last night?
She hit all the right notes, Andrew. Indeed, she's been hitting all the right notes since Joe Biden dropped out on Sunday. Just to recap the last crazed, almost 40 hours. As soon as Biden dropped out and then endorsed Kamala Harris, the Harris folks were ready to move across media with their rollout. In other words, they've been planning this for days. And that's why you saw that series of endorsements that followed, to the point where she was able to claim yesterday that she already has clinched the nomination with a majority of delegates. Then on Monday, in the first media appearance, you had the photo opportunity with student athletes, which is always a very good one to have. And she emphasized the Biden legacy, which I think is a very wise thing to do. It rightly pays tribute to Joe Biden and the achievements of this administration. But of course, that's also a Harris legacy, because the Biden folks have kept her in the shadows while Biden was planning to run for a second term. Now that she's in the light, as it were, she can also claim all those domestic, social, economic achievements that have been made since 2021. And then what you've highlighted in your introduction here is that you've got this value added with Harris, which you don't have with any other possible Democratic candidate, of being the former prosecutor. Or as she put it, in California, I prosecute sex abusers. Donald Trump has been convicted of being a sex abuser. I brought in one of the largest convictions against a Wall Street firm for fraud. Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of fraud.
Well, indeed so. But the thing is with Donald Trump, and this is a known factor, has been for a long time, that there are any number of obvious attack lines to take him on with, and that's probably only the most obvious one, that he is a convicted felon. But does pointing that out budge any voters at this point? Everybody knows this.
It's not a question of budging voters, Andrew, in the sense that those people who were bedded in with Trump are in with him come hell or high water. And they'll buy his line, his disinformation that this is all a Justice Department plot against him. Those people who are, hostile to Trump and that were bedded in with the Democrats, they're bedded in as well. What you're going, if you want to budge anyone, is you want to budge a fairly large group in between who haven't decided yet. There's a myth that's built up about Trump's base that it's a majority of Americans. 2020 showed that isn't true, nor is there a majority bedded in with the Democrats. You've got to get the independent voters. And here's the key, Andrew. The reason why the Democrats lost the election in 2016, but won it in 2020, was not because Trump galvanized people. It was because many people sat on their hands and didn't vote. And I think there's three groups to watch for here. It's going to be women voters. And the question of women's rights, especially reproductive rights, is also going to be front and center in this campaign. It's going to be what we call the suburban voters, those people who are not, locked into the urban areas or the diehard Republican rural areas, and it's going to be young voters. And I think young voters especially is what the Harris folks are doing, because alongside her speech yesterday, they had a very impressive social media campaign drawing upon all people, Charlie XCX.
We have seen already a hint of what the MAGA camp think are going to be the attack lines on Kamala Harris, which are that, she got married late in life, nudge, nudge, that she doesn't have children of her own. Obviously, there will be an amount of unsubtle pointing out that she is a woman and a woman of colour at that. But is that going to work for their camp? And once all that stuff gets wheeled out, what's her best means of responding to it? Is it just rising serenely above it, or do you try and point out that Donald Trump, of all people, is not in a position to make these judgments?
You probably do both, but you put the question to the voters: is misogyny and hatred of women really where you want to go as a nation? I think the Trump campaign made two very big miscalculations already, just before and just after the Biden announcement. I think the first miscalculation was to name J.D. Vance as vice president, largely because Trump, that's his guy. He likes J.D. They've got two white guys at the top of the ticket who have fairly similar attack lines. So there's no balance in terms of rhetoric. There's no balance in terms of gender. There's no balance in terms of race. Secondly, the immediate response of Trump was to come out and to mock Harris as a woman, with the line "laughing Kamala," his typical way of trying to insult whoever his opponent is. There was already clapback against that from a lot of women who rightly pointed out this is how men try to put women down: the way they dress, the way they act, the way they sound, which is why "Make America Laugh Again" is now also a trending line in social media. Trump followed that up with the line of "she's nuts, she's crazy." And then J.D. Vance, of course, has a line out there that she's a childless Catwoman. I don't think those lines actually work with most women in the United States. Now, we'll see. In other words, I don't think Trump can bully his way to the presidency versus Hillary Clinton in 2016 in 2024 versus Harris, partly because I don't think the lines will work, and partly because I think Harris is going to be a much tougher candidate than Clinton was.
Just finally and briefly, Scott, we are alleged to be hearing later tonight US time, and indeed everybody's time, from President Joe Biden. What do you expect him to say at this point?
Well, I expect him to say, first of all, I had COVID. So for all you conspiracy theorists out there, no, this wasn't a Democratic coup. No, I haven't been, tucked away in a basement somewhere and wheeled out. Then I expect him to come, fully on board with the endorsement of Kamala. I expect him to claim the legacies of the administration, to say that those legacies have to be continued. The job isn't done. And just as he saved democracy in 2020, the Harris campaign and good Americans everywhere need to save democracy in 2024.
Scott Lucas at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, thank you for joining us. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now here is Laura Kramer with the day's other headlines.
French President Emmanuel Macron has announced he won't name a new government until after the end of the Paris Olympics. It comes after the left-wing coalition, the New Popular Front, put forward a little-known civil servant, Lucile Cossette, as a candidate for prime minister. Macron said making a new appointment before mid-August would create disorder. The Olympics get underway with an opening ceremony in central Paris this Friday. 18 people have died after a regional passenger plane belonging to Nepal's Surya Airlines crashed and caught fire while taking off from the capital, Kathmandu. The plane, carrying 2 crew members and 17 technicians, was going for regular maintenance to Nepal's new airport. The country has a poor air safety record. Nearly 350 people have died in plane or helicopter crashes since 2000. And a Chinese lunar probe has found traces of water in samples of the moon's soil. The rover completed its mission in 2020, returning to Earth with rock and soil samples from the lunar surface. According to Chinese scientists, the samples revealed the presence of trace water. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Laura. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Since Russia launched its full-scale assault on Ukraine 2.5 years ago, a popular theory has held that this war will last as long as China permits it to. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba is testing this idea with a visit to Beijing beginning today. Kuleba will meet his Chinese analogue Wang Yi, among others. Kuleba has said that Ukraine is willing to negotiate towards what he called a fair peace. It remains to be seen whether China's ideas on this front are closer to Russia's or Ukraine's. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Olga Tokaryuk, journalist and fellow at Chatham House, who is presently in Chernivtsi. Olga, first of all, is it clear what Kuleba hopes to accomplish by visiting China? Does he really think he can talk them out of supporting Russia?
Hello, Andrew, and nice to hear from you. Well, I think this visit is really significant because it's the first visit between a Ukrainian and Chinese official, first bilateral meeting since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So before that, there was just a phone call, but there was no visit. And this visit comes at the invitation of the Chinese part, which I think is interesting and curious. Why would China be interested in hosting a Ukrainian foreign minister in this particular point of time? But we can come back to that later. What Kuleba hopes to achieve, I think Kuleba is probably hoping to explore the ways on whether it is possible to shift China's position on Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine closer to the Ukrainian position, because we know that China declares it is neutral, but at the same time, China has been providing Russia with economic lifeline by buying its oil, by supplying components for its war machine. While not directly supplying weapons, China has been sustaining Russia's war effort. And we also know that China has been coming up with some peace proposals, most recently with a joint peace proposal with Brazil in May this year. And in many respects, those proposals, they echoed some of Russia's narratives. They talked about the need to consider Russia's security interests and so on. So I think what Ukraine's foreign minister is trying to do is he is testing the ground on whether it is possible to shift China's position closer to President Zelensky's peace formula.
I mean, does Kuleba and Ukraine have a positive case they can make to the Chinese? Because there's the obvious case they can make to China that Russia's invasion, is wrong and bad and all kinds of illegal. But if China cared about that, they'd have cared about it before now. Is there an argument that Kuleba can make that Ukraine might actually be a more valuable partner to China down the track than Russia can be?
Yeah, I've been reading carefully his declarations made in Guangzhou, where he met with Wang Yi. And something that he said, one thing he said that China's role as a global force for peace is important, and that he's convinced that a just peace in Ukraine is in China's strategic interest. So kind of trying to appeal to China's seeing itself as a global power and kind of appeal to China's ambition to make a contribution to the global peace. And the second thing, which I think was interesting, that he mentioned Ukraine's irreversible, and I quote, path towards joining the European Union. And he said that Ukraine could play a role in developing trade between China and Europe, and that bilateral relations between Ukraine and China could contribute to China's relations with Europe. And just the most recent statement, he also spoke about a possibility of regional cooperation and participation of China in the development of Mykolaiv region, because he mentioned that Guangdong province that he's visiting has been a partner of Mykolaiv Oblast of Ukraine since 1994. He invited Chinese business to invest in this part of Ukraine. So I think, Ukraine is trying to find those kind of common points of interest that could be appealing for China. And I think, coming back to the issue, why would China be interested in having this meeting now? What Ukrainian experts have been saying, and I tend to agree, is that China is increasingly worried about a possible election of Donald Trump as the next U.S. president. They want to they are anxious that the position of Europe might become more rigid on China, and so they kind of want to explore other ways of how China's global standing could be strengthened before the possible bigger crisis in its relationship with the US, and maybe possibly China's participation or inclusion, at least in the possible peace process between Ukraine and Russia, looks like an appealing opportunity for Beijing.
And while we have you, Olga, you are talking to us from Ukraine, from a town near Ukraine's border with Romania. On a day-to-day level, how close does the war feel to where you are now?
Well, this is one of the safest parts of Ukraine, I must say. There are air raid alerts, but in more than 2 years of war, there were very few missiles launched by Russia in this region, mostly targeting energy infrastructure, and those missiles have been intercepted. However, it is, the impact of war is being felt even in this relatively safe part of Western Ukraine. In terms of casualties, of course, every family has lost someone in the war, huge cemeteries growing basically in every village. And, something that also all of Ukraine is experiencing at this moment are widespread blackouts, electricity cutoffs, because Russia destroyed half of Ukraine's energy grid in its attacks in recent weeks and months. So the sound that is now persistent everywhere you walk, even here in Chernivtsi, is the sound of generators that people are using to get by, because there can be up to 12 hours without electricity per day at the moment. And it is summer, it is easier to bear lack of electricity because the daylight hours are long, but it is also difficult because it has been a very hot summer in Ukraine, so people have to get by without air conditioning, with no electricity, and with very a lot of concern over what the upcoming winter is going to look like.
Olga Tokariuk, thank you as always for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Governments of a good few African countries would have watched last month's demonstrations in Kenya with an amount of nervousness, not least as they compelled Kenya's government to drop the tax hikes which prompted them. Kenya's neighbour Uganda appears to be discovering that any such trepidation was justified. Uganda's capital, Kampala, was yesterday beset by anti-corruption protests in defiance of a preemptive ban. At least 60 people have been arrested. Well, joining me for more from Kampala is Nicholas Barrio, Wall Street Journal correspondent for Uganda and the Great Lakes. Nicholas, welcome back to the show. What scale have these demonstrations assumed? How much of Kampala did they take up?
Thanks so much for having me over. Yes, so mainly they are concentrated in the central business district, which covers an area maybe around 2-3 square meters large. So they did cover large parts of the central business district, a lot of streets and many areas around the parliament.
I mean, there's probably not a short answer to this question, but how entrenched is corruption as a day-to-day reality in Uganda? We have, of course, recently seen several officials sanctioned by the UK and the US over this, including the Speaker of Uganda's Parliament.
Yeah, so this has been really an endemic problem, but in recent years, it has appeared to worsen, especially in Parliament. What makes it so rampant in Parliament is that it's the only government institution which is allowed to determine its salaries, its emolument. So there is a general feeling in the population that the parliamentarians are abusing these powers because they allocate whatever amount of allowances they need, and yet most of Ugandans don't have jobs, don't lack basic services. So it's such a big problem, especially with the parliament.
I mean, has there been a particular trigger for these demonstrations? Was there one special incident that got people angry?
Yes, so this has been going on for a few months, and one was this parliamentary exhibition where a group of activists kept sharing pay slips of lawmakers online, sharing payments being made in the office of the parliamentary speaker. But of particular interest, I think the events in Kenya appeared to inspire the Ugandans, the Ugandan youth, that they can also do it because the Kenyans were really much well organized. So the Ghanaians appear to have been keeping an eye to the events in Nairobi.
I mean, is there a widespread discontent with the rule of President Yoweri Museveni, who is, of course, at this point, an extremely old man, nearly 80, has been in power incredibly since 1986, which I suspect is longer than most Ugandans have been alive? Is there a generational discontent going on here?
Yes, that's true, especially among the young people, because a majority of these Ugandans were not born when he became president. So among the young people, he's the only president they've known. There is no succession plan. The elections are always lopsided, and there appears to be most Ugandans are frustrated with the fact that it doesn't look like he's going anywhere soon, and he appears to be grooming his son to take over. So that has appeared to really anger a lot of young people.
I mean, Uganda does have at least one prominent opposition figure. This is, of course, Bobi Wine, a much younger man than President Museveni, the leader of the National Unity Platform. There have been reports that their headquarters in Kampala has been surrounded by security forces. Does Bobi Wine appear to be playing any role in these protests, or are they an entirely organic thing?
So he offers an inspiration to these young people, and he's somebody a lot of young people have looked up to. But in this particular case, the protests appear to have been spontaneous. He's an inspiration, he's a figure that people look at, but the young people look as if they had already organized themselves, because most of these things that trigger this anger are already out there on the internet.
Nicholas Barrio in Kampala, thank you for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Time now for the latest business headlines with the head of investment at Interactive Investor, Victoria Scholar. Victoria, first of all, what depth of condolence should we be offering Tesla stockholders this morning?
It's not the best day because the stock has fallen by about 8% ahead of the US market open this lunchtime. And it's after the electric vehicle giant reported second quarter profits, which plunged by 45%. Car revenues also fell by 7% versus last year, and its profit margins shrank. Elon Musk, the CEO, of course, he also postponed the unveiling of its first fleet of self-driving robo-taxis, something that shareholders and investors had been very excited about. And it's been a tough period for Tesla. It's had to cut its prices around the world to try and spur demand and boost sales amid intense competition and slowing demand, particularly in China. It also announced plans to cut 10% of its workforce, or around 14,000 staff, back in April. And the stock has underperformed the wider US stock market, and it's also underperformed the so-called Magnificent Seven tech stocks, the likes of Nvidia, Apple and Microsoft, which have been flying this year.
And do we know what is driving the disillusion? Is it dissatisfaction with the Tesla products themselves, or is the insistence of the proprietor of making a fool of himself on social media part of this?
Well, I think it's the broader economic backdrop and a lot of governments postponing their net zero targets that means that there's less urgency to shift to electric than there was, say, a year or two ago. Also, we're seeing a whole host of new players come to the market with EV rivals, and Tesla's in that difficult spot where its price point is actually pretty high. So it's not exactly a mass market car, but it wants to try and penetrate markets like China, which already have some formidable EV players, the likes of BYD, for example.
We're also seeing, in further gloomy news, a downturn in the luxury sector.
Yes, that's right. So it looks as though consumers, even at the very high end part of the market, aren't shielded from cost of living pressures anymore with higher interest rates and inflation. Even they've been making cutbacks on things like luxury handbags and champagne. And that's really hurt LVMH, the French luxury giant that's often seen as the bellwether for the luxury industry, because it reported weaker than expected profits. And we've seen that demand from China, again, has been particularly disappointing. We've seen sales in Asia, mostly accounted for by Chinese spenders, that fell by 14% in the second quarter. And one analyst said that the sector is likely to remain out of favour in the near term, where we're seeing that shares in LVMH are down quite heavily. And then there's the read across that's weighing on some of the other luxury players like Richemont and Hermes, which are also nursing losses today.
Well, if we can close on a semi-note of optimism, then there are at least, I guess, mixed fortunes, we could say, in the budget airline sector.
Yes, that's right. So EasyJet is managing to defy some doom and gloom in the industry because it said it's expecting a record-breaking summer, and it reported a 16% surge in its first half profits. But this is in stark contrast to what we saw from Ryanair, its rival, on Monday, when shares tumbled by about 17% when it reported a drop in profits, and it said it expected falling ticket prices. EasyJet enjoyed an 11% jump in sales and said it's already sold 1.5 million more seats for the summer than at the same point last year.
Victoria Scholar, thanks as always for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller, and finally on today's show I am joined in the studio by Monocle's Tom Webb and Carlotta Ribello, who will be heading to Paris tomorrow to prepare for a brand new show that will be broadcast from the French capital. Excellent second mention there. You have both taken time out from tuning your tiny accordions in preparation for the trip to be here. Carlotta, you are far from the only Monocle staffers who are going to Paris. Pretty much the entire station is decamping. I will be going on Sunday. What am I doing? And therefore, what are our listeners hearing once we all get there?
Yes, Andrew, you are part of our team. Disclaimer. We'll be, as you said, heading to Paris tomorrow, Tom and I, and David Stevens, to start setting up for then the arrival of the rest of the team. From Sunday onwards, we'll be broadcasting from Paris. Our pop-up radio studio is located at the So Hotel.
Mm-hmm. That's good to know.
With a beautiful view of the River Seine and very close to City Hall and within the Olympics red zone. So that's the protected area. But yes, we will be broadcasting a brand new show called Monocle in Paris, which airs immediately after the Globalists. So it will air every day at 8 a.m. London time, 9 a.m. Paris time, 1 hour program. And then your show, The Monocle Daily, will be coming from Paris as well at 7 p.m. local time. And yeah, will be, of course, a bit of a change in format because we will have lots of local guests looking at the games through the Monocle lens, but should be exciting.
Tom, what else can you tell us?
Well, we are going to be broadcasting these very special programmes fully from the city, but we are journalists after all, and we will be out and about across the city, going to the various houses which pop up at every Olympics, and we're going to be broadcasting live throughout the next few days and the weekend as we look to the opening ceremony, which you are missing, sadly, but we will be there along the banks of the Seine.
Tom, this all does sound suspiciously like work, which was not how it was sold to me at all.
How was it sold to you, Andrew?
I don't know. I was anticipating a lot of, like, sipping absinthe in quiet cafes and, maybe occasionally filing the odd philosophical monologue.
No, the Daily will be live, hosted by you. Andrew and I are living together for 2 weeks.
I'm glad you jumped in at the end there with those key last 3 words. Yes, we will be flatmates. There's a variety of sitcoms in waiting going on here with the living arrangements.
I think you might need to sip some absinthe to survive that.
Carlotta has lived with me on one of these trips.
On one of these trips. And I'm here to tell the story. That's all the feedback I can give you. Just have a bit of red wine and cheese at home. That should do the trick in terms of socialising with your flatmate.
But to get our listeners as excited about this as we are, how does this all start, Carlotta? When you actually get there, talk us through what is involved in setting up an outside broadcast pop-up radio station.
Well, so we take what we call our outside broadcasting kit, which is a portable radio studio. Everything from the technical side of it, making sure we have all the microphones, all the cables, the mixing desk, but then also a bit of set dressing. We have, the Monocle Radio on-air sign and a few other design elements to make our presence known. It's a full day of setting up and testing the lines and all of that. The very first broadcast will be this Monocle on Sunday at 10 a.m. Paris time, hosted from our pop-up location. And as Tom mentioned, we will also be out and about reporting back in to the shows. So it will be very busy, but very exciting.
It's a 40-kilogram case, by the way. I just took it to Barcelona, and the limit on British Airways was 32 kilograms. So obviously I got undressed, and I dressed myself in the studio equipment, and I smashed a speaker on my way home. So we may be a little bit light going out.
You might need to speak louder, I guess.
But 40 kilograms or otherwise, does this technically mean that we could relocate the station anywhere? Because the surfing events are occurring in Tahiti, which I suspect is agreeable at this time of year, or indeed any.
We'll be flying BA, so we couldn't possibly go. No, we have to stay in Paris, Andrew.
Oh, never mind. Well, there's always next time, I guess. Tom Webb and Carlotta Rebello, thank you both for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Germani, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday UK. I'm Andrew Muller. Thanks for listening.